This is Ed Salzberg. I'm the Managing Director of the Security and Sustainability Forum.
And I welcome you to our webinar on why companies should care about biodiversity. It's going to be led by Leah Gerber, who's the Director of the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes at Arizona State University. I'm really pleased she's on this session to lead it, and I'll give you a little more information about her in just a second. I really thank Arizona State University's School of Sustainability, which is sponsoring this webinar, and several others in a four-part series that we're doing this year. We have several webinars in the planning stage. Actually, I think we have 8, but only one scheduled. The next one is on February 1st, and it's the second in a series on restoring the carbon balance. And this is about meeting the climate goals and trying to stay beneath the 1.5 degrees centigrade that scientists believe we need to avoid any of the really catastrophic impacts of climate change. Very difficult, extremely important webinar series. It is a 3-part series, and you can learn more about it at lightspeedsolutions.org. You can register there, or you can register at the SSF website. As I said, Leah Gerber is the director of the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes at Arizona State University. As the founding director, her work really aims to accelerate the success of biodiversity management and sustainability and sustainable outcomes and sustainable biodiversity outcomes by fostering relationships among academics and decision makers. And she brings together partnerships that promote biodiversity across a diverse set of organizations. She's a population ecologist. She studies the demographics of long-lived marine species. She has a tremendous background, and I'm really pleased that she's taken over the leadership of this session. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leah to lead you through the agenda and introduce the panelists and get us started.
Okay, thank you, Ed. I appreciate the opportunity to join this webinar, and I am very grateful for our esteemed panelists as well. This is a topic that I think is of great importance in the future of our planet. And as Ed mentioned, I lead a center here at Arizona State University called the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes. And as an academic scholar who has been trained in the field of population ecology and conservation science, it's been a tremendous learning experience to sort of, so to speak, escape the ivory tower and learn from these cross-sector partnerships about innovative ways that we can actually achieve outcomes via new ideas that emerged through these partnerships. So with that, in that spirit, in today's webinar, we'll hear from panelists representing multiple sectors, starting with the academic sector. Then we'll hear from the NGO sector, as well as the corporate sectors about why and how companies consider biodiversity. And I think I'm very much looking forward to a discussion about how some of these fundamental ideas that are sort of the cornerstones and foundations of ecology are being translated and what companies are actually doing. So some of the themes that I think you'll look forward to will start with what exactly is biodiversity, why do companies care, what can companies do better, and what can academics do better. And so just a quick overview of our agenda for today. As we speak, I'm doing an introduction. We'll then hear short presentations from each of the panelists. We then are planning to allow plenty of time for discussion. 20 minutes to field questions from the online question box. Each panelist will have some time for a final statement, and then Ed will close the session. Just a quick reminder, at the end, the last slide will have an exit survey. It would be wonderful. I encourage you all to fill out that survey so we can learn from this process. Okay, so now on to the introductions. I am delighted to introduce this distinguished panel. First, we will hear from Dr. Beth Polidoro. Dr. Polidoro is an assistant professor in ASU's School of Mathematical and Natural Sciences. She is an associate, she's also the Associate Director of Research for our Center for Biodiversity Outcomes. Her research is largely in applied toxicology and risk assessment in the context of biodiversity conservation. She also works on human health and sustainable development. Beth has been working in collaboration with various government, corporate, and conservation agencies and offers expertise in developing custom decision tools and data sets to support improved decision-making in natural resource management and risk mitigation. So thank you, Beth, for joining us. Following Beth, we will move on to Jen Molnar, who is the director of the Center for Sustainability Science with the Nature Conservancy, which is a new center that Jen recently founded. She is a leader in incorporating nature into human decisions at the corporate and policy level. Jen's new center is focused on enabling transformative change by filling science gaps that are inhibiting large-scale uptake and implementation of sustainability solutions through corporate practices and policy. So the idea of the structure of our webinar is we're starting with sort of the basics and the fundamentals of, from academia, why do we think companies should care and what is biodiversity. Then we're going to move into the NGO sector with Jen sort of saying, okay, well that's what we know, but in the real world, how is this making its way into the corporate world? And then we actually get to hear from the corporate world about what is actually happening. So we'll then hear from Mark Weick, who is the Director of Sustainability at Dow Chemical. Mark directs planning and implementation of their 2015 sustainability goals, as well as leads sustainability integration across the company and business units. He's responsible for directing Dow's future sustainability strategy, as well as the company's enterprise risk management efforts. Mark also leads Dow's global collaboration with the Nature Conservancy on valuing ecosystem services and biodiversity. Following Mark, we will hear from Gabriela Borjan, who is a Senior Director of Sustainable Development at Monsanto. Gabriela is responsible for company and stakeholder integration within this realm of sustainable agriculture. She leads the adoption of innovative business solutions which optimize environmental performance. For example, she focuses on water and carbon in addressing society's concerns and establishes, she's the established liaison between Monsanto and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, for whom we seem to all be working regularly these days. So this is what we have lined up for you today. One quick note before I hand it off to our speakers is we do want this to be as interactive as possible. There is a mechanism on the webinar for you to jot down your questions, and I'll be leading a discussion with those questions following the presentations. So with that, I'd love to hand it over to Dr. Polidoro.
Okay. Thank you, Leah. I'm going to start off the panel talking a little bit about, as an introduction, why do businesses care about biodiversity, and then why should they care about biodiversity? So over the summer, I was lucky enough to attend a meeting on a biodiversity workshop forum with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And it was attended by a number of member companies. And the first question I asked them, coming from an academic background, I said, well, so why do you care about biodiversity? What are the things that motivate you to account for biodiversity in your activities? And these were their answers. And I'm sure there's other ones out there that are not included here. But the number one reason was license to operate, regulatory compliance. Also, businesses that promote green activities or sustainable practices or promote biodiversity conservation within their products or activities also tend to have a more positive public image. And in many cases, the development or support of sustainable products or products that encourage biodiversity conservation can be seen to have increased competitiveness in the market. In other words, consumers are maybe opting for those types of products. Also, at the stakeholder interest and in terms of board members or in terms of stakeholders, there might be higher interest in companies that, again, promote sustainable practices and or account for biodiversity. And lastly, another one that I thought was really interesting was that the workforce, people actually working for the companies, tended to have higher morale or better visioning of their company if they were focused on things other than the simply money-making aspects, but in terms of increasing their positive outlook on how they impact biodiversity. So I thought those were interesting. Again, there's probably some that are missing here, but I thought that was very interesting. Let's see, double click. Oops, too fast there. So why should businesses care about biodiversity? Biodiversity, as Leah mentioned, has been defined a number of different ways. I think the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes has adopted one of the more standard definitions of biodiversity in the sense that it is essentially species. It's the variety of living species on Earth and the ecosystems that they form. So we have to remember that habitats and ecosystems are actually formed of species. And over the past decade or so, we've had tremendous loss of biodiversity. In fact, over the past 5 decades, it's estimated that about 60% of biodiversity has been lost since about the 1970s, with losses on track to reach almost 70% by 2020. And it's for these reasons that we have a number of international conventions and accords, the Center for Biological Diversity, and other instruments that are now tracking biodiversity loss so that we can come up with ways to slow or halt biodiversity loss at the global scale. However, biodiversity is often, impacts to biodiversity and the conservation of biodiversity is often at the local scale. The International Union for Conservation of Nature is one of the world's global gold standards for assessing the loss of biodiversity at both local, regional, and global scales. And currently, of the approximately 44,000, 45,000 species that have been assessed that are present in comprehensive taxonomic clades, what that means is the way the IUCN prefers to assess species is by entire clades. So in other words, all the world's mammals, or all the world's reptiles, or all the world's amphibians. So of those groups that have been comprehensively assessed, it's 38% of species have been assessed at an elevated risk of extinction, meaning that either their rates of decline are occurring faster than their ability to recover, and or they are inherently threatened by very small population sizes, very small geographic range, in the midst of a number of pressing threats. And then you can see some of the statistics on the slide there. About 20 of those 38%, you can break it down into different species groups. 22% of the world's mammals are threatened with extinction, 31% of amphibians, 14% of birds, etc. So I think one of the key aspects of accounting for biodiversity in business activities is to make the link between biodiversity, natural capital, and ecosystem services. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but I think it's what people often forget is that biodiversity or species can be viewed as part of the natural capital stock, along with clean water, clean air, fertile soils, etc., as they collectively constitute key habitats and contribute to the provision of ecosystem services. So what does that mean? So for example, there are 70 mangrove species across the world. And these 70 species in various compositions comprise mangrove habitat in tropical areas around the world, which contributes to the provisioning of clean water, nutrient cycling, coastal storm protection, and also serve as nursing grounds for juvenile fishes, many of which are important in commercial fisheries. Okay, click, move, okay. Oops, I'm going too fast there, go back. Oh, sorry, I'm losing control here. Okay. Okay, so other reasons that companies should care about biodiversity is that biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation can directly present a wide range of risks to companies, particularly those companies that have, we like to call like a heavy ecological footprint. In other words, they rely, their businesses rely on extractive resources such as oil and gas, forestry, agriculture, etc. Also those production companies that are involved in supply chains where they require raw resources from other areas in order to assemble their products. And so there's a number of risks that can be involved for actual business production when you have a loss of biodiversity or associated ecosystem services. And these can be broken down into physical risks, reduced productivity, scarcity and increased cost of resources, disruption of operations. Regulatory risk is increasingly coming into play, where you might have reduced quotas or litigations due to excessive extractions. Market risk, where you have changing consumer preferences or purchase requirements, and other risks such as risk to your reputation, financial risk, or again, supply chain risk. And so I think accounting for biodiversity early in the operational or even planning stages can help to identify what those risks might be beforehand and take steps or actions to either prevent or reduce risk or to perhaps mitigate risk if there are opportunities. And many of these activities in terms of risk mitigation and accounting for biodiversity risk can often be made better in collaboration with partnerships and multi-stakeholders who have a really diverse and better idea of what all of the factors are in terms of accounting for biodiversity. Oops. So just the last slide here on why should businesses care about biodiversity. The Business Coalition in 2013 estimated that approximately $7.3 trillion annually were lost due to external environmental costs of businesses. So these include things like water use, pollution or land conversion, greenhouse gas emissions, waste generation, etc. That the cost of operating select businesses on the environment were creating $7 trillion in costs annually to the environment. However, what's really interesting about this report is these costs don't actually include biodiversity loss. They don't account for impacts on species or impacts on habitats or impacts on ecosystem function or ecosystem services contributed to by species. So this number is likely much higher if you account for impacts to biodiversity. So why doesn't this number account for biodiversity? Well, this is largely in part due to the difficulty, right, in quantifying the inherent value of biodiversity and the value of ecosystem services and ecosystem functions that biodiversity can provide. For example, let's take a ground-dwelling plant species, or even a butterfly. There might not be much known about its contribution to the ecosystem as a whole or ecosystem services in terms of the science. Although depending upon the species, one could argue that water retention and shading would be an ecosystem service from the plant, and or pollination depending upon the area, or control of pests in terms of the butterfly, depending upon the context and what we know. But often, I wouldn't say more often than not, but often the connection between species and ecosystem services may not be known, may be poorly known, may be incredibly complex, and or difficult to communicate. and therefore is not traditionally included in many cost-benefit analyses conducted by companies and policymakers. So, but interestingly enough, in another survey that was conducted in 2010, 27% of CEOs were actually concerned about biodiversity loss. So there is an interest and there is a concern, but I think some of the difficulties lies in actually quantifying and capturing impacts to biodiversity. So this is where I feel that a multi-stakeholder and multidisciplinary approach can improve how biodiversity can be accounted for by businesses. So in a study led by Arizona State University and graduate students over the past year, we did a series of interviews with corporate sustainability leaders and also reviewed a number of studies on produced by businesses on biodiversity, sustainability, and ecosystem services accounting within their organizations. And we found a couple gaps in why that may explain why biodiversity wasn't being accounted for in their sustainability actions and sustainability accounting. And these had to do with basically could be divided into three different groups. So in terms of awareness, there seemed to be basically a lack of understanding between biodiversity and ecosystem services. In other words, how does biodiversity contribute to and form part of ecosystem function and ecosystem services in terms of awareness. And also, we found that there wasn't a lot of documentation in actually valuing biodiversity in business decision making. In other words, providing the business case study. So that was an area for improvement. We also saw an area of improvement of actually providing data and tools, custom data and custom tools at times that could help to promote planning and management of biodiversity impacts for different sectors. In other words, sector-specific data, sector-specific tools that could really focus on those biodiversity impacts from that particular company activity and provide them information that was tailored to their risks and needs, mitigation strategy, and impact on natural resources.
Time?
Yes, time. Oh, thank you. And so lastly, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of these tools that we've been able to develop. Since one of the roles of academia, I think, is to innovate partnerships with corporations and to provide capacity, an interdisciplinary breadth of experience, and a number of student opportunities. Remember, universities are also opportunities to train the next generation of conservation and sustainability leaders that are working in corporations. So I just want to share with you one of these tools. Go ahead here. Oops. So one of these tools that we've developed over the past 6 months is targeted toward the oil and gas sector, and it is a live internet tool where you can just draw a polygon anywhere in the Gulf of Mexico, and all the species that are present in that polygon, as well as proximity to marine protected areas, key biodiversity areas, as well as their species extinction risk. And an interesting component that we've added from the academic sector is each species petrochemical vulnerability index. So what that means is we've ranked every single species, over 3,000 species, what is their vulnerability to oil and gas exposure. So that even if you have a threatened species, maybe it's not actually vulnerable to oil and gas exposure. Or vice versa, you might have a threatened species, but it is vulnerable to oil and gas exposure. So this type of information actually tailors the impact on biodiversity to the actual sector and what their impacts might be. And additionally, this type of information can be used in the mitigation hierarchy, the biodiversity offsets mitigation hierarchy that you see here. In other words, if I draw a polygon over here and I impact a high number of threatened species with high petrochemical vulnerability, maybe there's another area over here that has low species vulnerability, and we might be able to use that to assist ourselves in working through this biodiversity offset mitigation hierarchy in terms of mitigating impacts in a high-risk zone by improving or moving the operations to a low-risk zone. Okay, so I don't want to go over, I have another tool here that I could talk about, the GIST tool. This one, since we're out of time, I will just point it, this one's live online already, so I'll let you, you can just Google the Earth genome, and this tool is live online already. It's for water resource use in the Rio Brazos region of Texas.
Great, well thank you, Beth. This is Jen Molnar. So picking up where Beth left off with a great overview of why companies should be thinking about and accounting for biodiversity in their decision making, I wanted to take the next step and look at how can ecological science be brought into business decisions and touch on the role of NGOs in this as well. So just to start with, the Nature Conservancy thinks it's really important that we are engaging with companies as part of our conservation strategies. Companies have a huge impact on the planet, both positive and negative, and it's critical for our mission success that we're both working to help them reduce their negative impacts, but there are also opportunities that Beth pointed to a bit on where we can actually engage to create new solutions that can help us scale up the impact of our positive outcomes for nature. Let's see if yep. And so Beth laid out a lot of really important reasons why companies should be thinking about biodiversity. So why is it that they're not? Why hasn't this just become business as usual as they're thinking about risks or thinking about business opportunities? Well, some of it is coming from the fact that it's just hard to do. Companies have a number of metrics and tools where they know how to understand the labor costs and how that impacts their decisions, or the risk of interruption of different resources like oil and gas. But when it comes to understanding the role of nature and how it's relevant to their business, they don't always have consistent tools to do that. So whether it's how that forest in the picture here is providing cleaner water to a facility, or how they can reduce their negative impacts on biodiversity, there haven't been consistent ways for companies to bring that into decisions. So that means that nature is often being undervalued, and companies may not be seeing related risks or opportunities as they're making decisions. So how do we change that? It starts with just broadening awareness and raising awareness at both the corporate level and at individual decision maker level across the company to understand how nature is relevant to their decision making and how they can bring that into decisions. And then we need to be able to translate that science into tools that are relevant in a business context. So how do we bring credible ecological science into decisions at the right resolution and timeline and scales that are needed? And then often there needs to be enabling policies in place. This can be within the company, but also at the government level, that are at least allowing nature to be considered and nature-based solutions to be included in strategies, but often it'd be great also if they're actually incentivizing the inclusion of this. So I wanted to walk through an example, and there are a lot of different ways that nature is relevant to business. And one aspect of this is where nature can actually play the role of built infrastructure. This could be a matter of trees cleaning the air or filtering our water. It could also be wetlands absorbing floodwaters and reducing impact downstream. On this slide, I have examples of coastal protection, so how coastal ecosystems can help buffer communities and facilities from storm damage along our coastlines. And the numbers on this slide really highlight some of the research that's been done recently to make that connection between how those coastal ecosystems really play an important role in our coastlines. Everything from coral reefs protecting over 200 million people from storms along coastlines to the physical role that these ecosystems play, from reefs reducing wave energy to mangroves reducing wave height. So we're increasingly having an understanding of how not only how these ecosystems function, but how they can provide benefits to people. And that helps both raise the awareness of how nature can really be critical to decision making, but also helps point us to where and how they can be really relied on for these services and where they might be able to actually replace built infrastructure. But if we take it from raising awareness to actually building into decisions, we need to have metrics so that these ecosystems can be assessed alongside other potential options for in business strategies or in development strategies along coastlines. This is a graphic that comes out of work that the Nature Conservancy did with Swiss Re, looking at a wide variety of different types of coastal protection solutions. And on the horizontal axis here is the width of these bars is the averted damages each solution offers, and the the height of the bars is the benefit-cost ratio. So if the bar is going above that red line there, indicating it's cost-effective. So you can see you're able to compare directly the fact that sandbags are very cost-effective, but they're not providing a lot of damage aversion, but oyster restoration and marsh conservation focused on risk reduction can offer really cost-effective solutions in the right place at the right time. So this kind of data allows engineers and risk managers to look at these ecosystems as part of their solutions for thinking about how do we develop more resilient and protected coastlines. And that can help at individual project levels, but as we move towards scaling up investment in these kind of strategies, we need broader, for broader uptake, we need to have an understanding of what are the performance standards for how these ecosystems provide those benefits. This, again, allows those engineers to bring nature directly into their toolbox as they're thinking about how do they protect coastlines alongside options that are more built infrastructure dependent. And then in addition to cost effectiveness, understanding how can these projects be financed. This isn't because we're not just building new infrastructure, new ways of thinking about how do we bring money to these kind of projects. And a common challenge in these coastal protection projects is the fact that if a coastal marsh is providing a benefit to a community, so a levee doesn't need to get built, that avoided cost doesn't always get accounted for and able to be brought to bear in the investment in that marsh, just because the project budget would likely be shrunk. So looking at where is the cash flow coming from, where is the potential for financing these kind of projects, and understanding that as you look at how we can scale up this kind of work, including engaging sectors like the finance and insurance sectors. And then there's the opportunity. Obviously, many of you know the ecosystems along coastlines aren't just providing storm damage protection. This is also a matter of understanding how these ecosystems are providing benefits to communities, providing jobs and tourism, supporting fisheries, supporting recreation, providing critical habitat for wildlife. There are likely a lot of different stakeholders interested in the benefits from those ecosystems in addition to the storm damage risk reduction. So looking at who are the other stakeholders involved and who may be able to also support the scaling up of investment in nature. So as we look at bringing together ecological science into decisions within companies, it really points to the critical need for collaborating across sectors to bring together different types of expertise, both on the science and technical side, but also on the implementation side. This starts often with building trust across those different sectors and the people that are actually in the collaboration, because there's often a need to share how are decisions being made, what kind of data are available. There may be sensitive data available. So really having a shared understanding of what the work is that they're working on together, and then taking the opportunity to learn across cultures, across sectors, understand. Conservation scientists can understand where companies are coming from and as they're making decisions, and vice versa. And if we're able to bridge those differences, it allows us to create new solutions that neither sector could create on their own. And all of this is needed for the science to really be useful, to be both credible and point to the real underlying ecological understanding, but also be practical and useful to inform business decisions. So NGOs and nonprofits can be really valuable in these kind of collaborations, both by drawing on our vast experience in applying ecological science on the ground. For example, the Nature Conservancy has hundreds of scientists working around the world informing our conservation projects on the ground, as well as broader strategy work. And we also have a lot of experience implementing projects and partnering both on the science and implementation. So we can be a good cross-sector partner in a lot of this work. And as we're looking at how we can maximize our impact and our opportunities in doing this work, I wanted to share with you a snapshot and a little bit of a sneak preview of some work I've done working with some students at the Center for Business and Environment at Yale. They did a survey last fall looking across a number of different NGO corporate partnerships to see when is it that they actually are able to get to transformative change. And the bullets here are the definition they use to look at what do we really mean by getting to transformative change. So it was when partnerships were shifting core business practices or influencing industry norms over the long term, and creating substantial change and measurable outcomes for all parties involved, so both on the business side as well as on the conservation side. So they did a broad survey of over 30 different partnerships and then dove deeper into about 7 where they did interviews on both sides to talk to participants who are involved to identify what are the real success factors in these kind of partnerships and how do they actually get to that scale. So to share with you some of their findings, it started with the partnership being developed around a compelling business case. If the research question, if the collaboration wasn't formed around something that was core to the business, it wasn't something that was going to scale up within that business or beyond. But there also needs to be a shared common vision that met the missions or the drivers in both sides or all sides of the different organizations involved, both on the NGO and on the corporate side, that allowed the team to be focused and working together towards that vision. Relationships were critical in these partnerships. Interestingly, a number of them actually started because there had been a pre-existing relationship between leadership on both sides, on the NGO and corporate sides. So it points to, if you're looking to start one of these partnerships, look to your networks or build your networks with this type of partnership in mind. But relationships were also critical as you got into doing the work on the partnerships to build that trust, build the buy-in, maintain communication, both at the CEO leadership level, but also at all the different levels that are involved in the partnership, managing it day-to-day and getting into the real weeds of the work. There's a need for setting clear expectations, so everyone knew what the milestones were towards achieving that common vision. But there was also a need for the ability of the collaboration teams, the partnership teams, to evolve and to adapt as things changed, whether one of those expectations wasn't able to be met, so there was need to be an adjustment, or things changed within the business or externally that needed to be accounted for to be able to still be able to adjust and be on target for achieving that common vision. But each of the partnerships, everything from the TNC Dow partnership that Mark is going to talk about in a minute that I've been involved in, to CI and Starbucks, EDF, Walmart, WWF and Coca-Cola, all of these had different elements, different ways that they came together, but these were common elements across most of them that really helped get to that scale of impact by working across sectors. So to step back in conclusion, this is why we're really here and talking about this issue, that if we're able to raise awareness and enable companies to bring the value of nature, to bring an understanding of biodiversity into their decisions, it can identify those incentives, identify where they can avoid those risks or look to new opportunities. It allows us to spur new kinds of thinking and new kinds of solutions that can help us build stronger communities, better economies, and healthier nature as well. I will conclude there, but I'd love to hand off to Mark Weick, who's going to talk about the work that Dow is doing in this space.
Hello, and thank you, Jen. I've appreciated your work with us for over 6 years now, and I also want to give a special shout out to the dozens of Dow Chemical colleagues who have signed up for the webinar. Thanks for your support and turning this goal into reality. 2 years ago, in April of 2015, Dow launched its 2025 sustainability goals, building on 2 previous decades of sustainability work in the sets of 10-year goals that were our 2005 EH&S goals and our 2015 sustainability goals. One of our 7 goals is what you see here listed on the slide, where Dow will deliver $1 billion in net present value by 2025 by doing projects that are good for the company and better for ecosystems, better for nature. The Nature Conservancy helped us develop a metric that we're calling Nature's Future Value, or NFV, that goes in parallel with the Net Present Value metrics, NPV, by which we normally measure the value of projects. And we hope that this will help redefine the role of business in society as business cares more about nature. And the way that we're looking at this is to try to drive the links between business and nature. We always think about environmental impacts, but we've thought less about ecosystem services, the benefits that people get from nature that are supported by biodiversity. And so we're now evaluating projects that we're going to be doing not only for the purely economic value, or what economic value we can estimate based on environmental concerns or social concerns, but also based on the ecosystem services value. And the way that we're driving this is in the progression of our journey with nature that we've had over the past 20 years. Back in 1996, one of our Texas sites found a huge amount of value in using natural infrastructure by converting 110 acres of an existing wastewater treatment pond into a constructed wetlands for the purpose of naturally treating suspended solids, in other words, algae. The project cost a little bit less than $2 million versus an estimated $40 million for a typical industrial wastewater treatment plant. And what we wanted to do was try to leverage this kind of thinking and value across our organization. We looked for collaborators, and Jen helped us develop the collaboration that we have with the Nature Conservancy that started way back in 2011, and that's led to our thinking that established our 2025 Valuing Nature goal. If we look at what we've done that led up to this kind of thinking, we first analyzed some ecosystem services in a large facility that we operate in Texas, where we looked at how we could invest in nature to drive better ecosystem service value in areas of air quality, in coastal storm surge protection, and in fresh water supply. This slide shows some of our thinking and the analysis that we did, where we saw that a lot of the ways that we could work with ecosystem services and enhance nature would actually be cost competitive with some of the gray infrastructure solutions that we typically think about putting in place. And this led us to the thinking that we're doing now about the Valuing Nature goal, where we're trying to make sure that we identify the ecosystem services flows into and out of our facilities, how we collect business value for those, but also how the community benefits, and also how nature benefits as well. We started looking at these initial 8 ecosystem services, and with the help of several collaborators, built what we called the Ecosystem Services Identification and Inventory Tool, or for short, EASY tool, because it's designed to help someone who's not a biologist, not a trained scientist in any sense of the word, look at a particular piece of land and be able to evaluate ecosystem services rapidly and cost effectively at an initial level. And then, of course, if there's high value, we would use some larger tools, some larger efforts to be able to quantify the actual value that we're dealing with here. When we look at how business will derive value from this kind of revision in the way that we value projects, we'll see 4 different areas. I'm going to move to the next slide here to show some examples of how we do this. First is in the area of risk mitigation and resilience, where we'll see, for example, that green or natural infrastructure can sometimes provide the same kind of services, or in tandem with gray infrastructure can provide enhanced services, similar to the situation that we saw in Texas with the constructed wetland and that we're evaluating in other situations within Dow. We can also often see process improvements that will result in capital and operating and manufacturing or maintenance expense reductions. For example, water recycling projects or resource efficiency improvements that reduce our impact on nature. For example, some of the things that we put in place in Texas to reduce water demand and provide the river basin adequate flow even in dry times. We're also looking at assets. So we're looking at decisions that will help us enhance or maintain nature on site. So for example, land donations or sales, we've shown over the last couple of years can actually enhance the value to the company by considering the value of the ecosystem services, the value of the biodiversity on that particular site, in addition to the normal real estate value that a realtor would talk with you about. And in the 4th area, we're looking at innovation, new products that will help enhance nature. And so, for example, some of our agricultural products with traits that help plants resist drought. And so what we're doing is we're putting in place screening for all of our new product development projects, all of our new business model development projects, all of our real estate decisions, and all of our capital allocation decisions, starting with Nature's Future Value Zero, where all projects are screened. And of course, if I'm buying office chairs, very quickly we'd say, no, we don't need really further analysis here. But if we identify something where indeed there's a need for further analysis, we're going to take those and consider them for further review. And when we can demonstrate reliably that it's good for business as well as better for the ecosystems, we're going to be including that in the $1 billion. We've already generated more than $40 million worth of value in this goal in just a short period of time. And so this scorecard is going to result in us in reducing inputs, reducing waste, enhancing natural areas, enhancing biodiversity, as well as enhancing our communities. Because we believe that a business that learns from and is inspired by nature is going to be a business that's more resilient, more adaptive, and more innovative. And now I want to hand it over to a colleague who thinks in about the same way, my friend Gabriela Burian from Monsanto.
Well, I think you're muted.
Yes, now it's okay. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Then thank you, Mark. Thank you, Arizona State University for organizing, and thank you everyone for joining. And as you can see my accent, I'm not from Missouri. I'm originally from Brazil. And I have been here in the United States since 2012. What brought me here, in fact, it is business and biodiversity. We started some work, partnership, some years ago back in Brazil with Conservation International, and I will be going over and talk a little bit about what we have been doing and mention one more example. Then the agenda, Then the agenda for this next 10 minutes will be covering a little bit why, the reasons we have been investing, what's our approach, the strategy, and then going to the examples and what needs to be done, a little bit of action at the end. Then the main reasons, and I only select 3, of course there was a lot mentioned before, but I want to make the point related to, from our perspective. We are business, but we are business in agriculture. And the biodiversity is really all about agriculture and vice versa. Then for us, it's a matter of being there, our business of agriculture or not. Biodiversity is really crucial. Then only mentioning fresh water, soil, climate, all this is what allow us to enable farmers to produce more or less, and also farmers in some key specific areas to be more resilient with their production. This then is the first main critical reason. Second reason, biodiversity is also an awesome opportunity for collaboration with key stakeholders in the same area. When we have some specific starting points, local communities have another, etc., then it's a very good opportunity for a better engagement with the society. And finally, doing this, engaging and making sure we are reducing risk is a good way for the society to better understand and for us to better understand what society needs. Then it's a good way to show that we really are trying to reduce risk in order to make sure we will have our business there in the next years. Then all those 3 reasons together help us to develop our main positioning related to biodiversity. Then this is what we did together with key stakeholders, with local communities. We discussed it and we consider everything that was important to guide our actions and our strategy, relate products to systems and the way we act across the world, not only in the United States, but in key different areas. Then 2 main points, biodiversity and the landscape and ecosystem being very important to our business. We also added on top of this what has been said by the Convention of Biological Diversity in order to make sure we would be guided by the correct points considered by the Convention of Biological Diversity, such as conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity and landscape. Then our strategy in a simple way, and today we'll be talking only about one of these 3 points, but our strategy is guided by 3 points. That is, first, promote sustainable landscape with agriculture in there. That is sustainable agriculture landscape. We'll be talking a little bit about that. And we have more 2 other areas with actions too. That's promoting species across the world, and finally preserve and improve plant varieties. Those 3 help us to define what's important in terms of products, in terms of actions and partnerships. Then talking a little bit about the promoting sustainable landscape, in this map we can see the key biodiversity areas in red. Those areas are areas very important in terms of biodiversity and also very important to produce food. Then this is something that can create a little bit of stress if we don't manage correctly with everyone that is involved in there. Then what we have been doing here in the United States, since there is so many people from the United States in this call, I want only to mention one key partnership, but this is not the focus for today. We can have another one. So here in the United States, we have been very related together with other key stakeholders in the soil health partnership. The main point is really, and the TNC, by the way, work there too, and many other players. And then together with growers here in the United States, we have been developing key best practices to help others to follow. And the main idea is reduce greenhouse gas and also improve soil health. Then after that, you see there is Brazil and another area important, that is Indonesia, Asia Pacific. What we have been doing together with Conservation International, we started in 2008 in Brazil and in 2013 in Indonesia. Both are now going to a new different phase, and the last year, 2 years ago, in fact, we started to discuss with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the agriculture sector what we could do in terms of soil conservation, habitat preservation with partners, and reducing greenhouse gas too. Then in Brazil, we have been working with those 2 organizations, Conservation International and the World Business Council, together with many other players, in order to help growers to be part of the solution. Instead of being asked what needs to be done, they are also part of the decision-making process. Then they help us to figure it out, create important solutions to reduce greenhouse gas from agriculture sector. Talking about Indonesia now, that's one interesting example because we are finalizing one first wave about 3 years. In Indonesia, we have been working in one specific area, Sumatra, and the main challenge there was to keep the biodiversity, to keep forests, to help people understand that they could increase their income, help governments, local governments understand that it could be okay, it would be okay to do together to improve the income of those communities and at the same time preserve the forest. Then together with those players there, after those 3 years, we trained all the local governments that are very important in this region, farmers and their families, and all the people that are involved, communities, 1,500 communities, and the results, in terms of results, what's more important, and those are the last points there, we achieved a big area of forest protected, enabling a corridor. And this was only possible due to conservation agreement process, what helped people in the local community to better understand the value of forest. Then we achieved this. We also at the same time increase their corn productivity. What's important to call the attention here is those communities, of course, they are smallholders. It's not only about corn, it's coffee, it's local production of many other things. What we did here was to use the knowledge of our people in the field to help people relate to corn, that is one of our products. Then all the rest was, in terms of agroforestry, etc., was capacity building with Conservation International. Their income increased in some cases by 100%, and they better understood that they didn't need to cut the forest to have a better income. Reduced the expenses due to the agriculture because it was, we really have a lot of training, then they start to use better management process, and they start to need less products than before. As a result, of course, the region has a better resilience for climate. Then, of course, this is one specific. We have many other cases and important results, but what's in there for us, I would say, especially for this call, is that the value of multi-stakeholder collaboration. Then only with different perspectives, different views, we can build together a different approach and even helping improve lives. Where we are now with this partnership with Conservation International and also working with the agriculture sector in the World Business Council is we are launching this year a coalition for no deforestation in Brazil. The region is Mato Piba, 4 different states. And in Indonesia, the same process is ongoing now. We are discussing what's the next in order to stop being only one partnership, but being a big collaboration from the food ag sector that can really change the way we have been working in agriculture in the landscape. Then thank you all for the opportunity.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you to our panel. I thought that was a really interesting set of examples and insights from multiple sectors. What I found really striking is the convergence on the idea of the value of cross-sector and multi-stakeholder collaboration. So I think this is really, really has a lot of potential for addressing these challenges in mainstreaming biodiversity in the business sector. The first set of questions that I want to pose to the panel, what I'll do here, given where we are with time, is I'll take a few minutes to pose a few of the questions that we've set out a priori, and then I'll give panelists a chance to respond to some of the questions that we're seeing from the audience, which have been really great as well. So a general question that I have been reflecting on as I listen is, biodiversity, as Beth described in her presentation, we're experiencing an unprecedented rate of extinction. Once you lose a species, there's no bringing it back. This is not trivial. This is urgent. The decisions that companies make on a regular basis are impacting biodiversity. And so it's really encouraging to hear from the corporate sector that there's interest. I see the sort of barrier that we're facing in better communication, better coordination across sectors to address these challenges. But at the same time, we have this certain level of urgency. So given what we have learned from each other, we don't, and with this sort of devil's advocate premise that we don't really have time to figure this out or figure out how to work together or how do we address these issues. What really do we need to do now? How can we tackle these problems collectively? And I say that not only with respect to what makes the most sense for the corporate bottom line, but what makes sense is a human society. Arguably, biodiversity is valuable in the same way as art is valuable. So how do those kinds of ideas play into decisions that are made by companies? And how can we begin to overcome these barriers? So I'll throw that question out, I guess, first to Mark and Gabriella. I realize that this is perhaps a provocative question for you, but I'd be very curious, especially as an academic, hearing what are the immediate steps, what is needed most immediately to tackle this challenge that we're facing as a society?
I think, Leah, what academics and NGOs can help business do the most and do most urgently is to help translate the value of biodiversity and the value of ecosystem services into economics and into smart regulations. So economics and regulations are the ways that businesses typically will make a lot of decisions. Yes, there will be decisions made on aesthetics. Yes, there will be decisions made on things that we can't quantify. But if you can help us to get better estimates of the value of ecosystem services, the value of biodiversity that we can put into the normal business decision-making processes, then we'll see quicker adoption. Gabriella?
I totally agree with Mark. I would only add capacity building, of course, is crucial, and payment for ecosystem service. Also, we all have been doing some pilot projects, and I believe this is something that we should think together in a more collaborative way. How can we change the way we have been doing the consideration related to ecosystem service, especially for supply chain in agriculture sector?
Thank you very much. That's really interesting, and I think immediately I see a disconnect with how academia and to some extent the NGO sector, at least from our talks today, think about biodiversity. I think our premise is that ecosystems function based on biodiversity, and humans rely on ecosystems. And I think it's sort of there is some change in mindset needed to move from that operating assumption to, okay, we need to start translating this and changing our approach to thinking more about economics and regulation. So turning the question perhaps to Beth and Jen, I'm curious to hear from you about what from your expertise and your experience, and also hearing the great work that Dow and Monsanto are doing, what can companies be doing better? And the premise here is that clearly when including biodiversity, it makes sense in terms of a return on investment. That's easy, but in many cases, as we talked about, it's unclear. We don't have enough information. And the fundamental scientific challenge is that we haven't fully quantified the full spectrum of values. So what should we be advising companies to do? What should be our status quo? I'm curious to hear your perspective on, as scientists, what can companies be doing better?
Beth, you're still on mute?
Yes, I am now unmuted.
Okay.
Did you want to go ahead, Jen, or do you want? Go ahead.
Well, I was going to build on a little bit of what you mentioned, Leah, in terms of what we each need to change a bit. And we've Mark mentioned that I've been involved in the work with them on the TNC Dow collaboration, and what we've talked about a lot through that work is we've looked at how does a company really embed this in their core decision making on projects. Has been a need for culture change within the company to understand this new set of values that are bringing into their decisions. So it's partly about the science and the tools and how do we bring those valuations in, but it's also thinking about what needs to change within the culture as they're making those decisions, and it's behavior change is essentially what you're talking about at one level. So I think there is a need for ecologists, both in academia and NGOs, to understand how are decisions made, how can we bring economics and values into that, and values being broader than just dollar values. But also understand that on the corporate side, and the shift that they went through in the last few decades, or several decades ago, is bringing safety into their decisions and thinking about that as a fundamental culture change within the company, where they recognized, set protocols in place that safety was really critical at their factories and facilities, And now it's just part of how every Dow staff member is, and at a lot of manufacturing companies, how staff just think about their business. They start with safety moments. They start with, thinking about what's the safety involved in a project, whether it hits the bottom line or not. So ideally, nature becomes a bit more like that. Just it's partly the protocols they have to go through with the NSV and all of that, but also just becomes part of how they think about what they're doing. And I understand some of their staff are talking about introducing nature moments at the beginning of meetings as well, just to start bringing that new thinking and new innovation into their projects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is Beth, and I totally agree with what Jen said, and I just had another thought, kind of more of a technical thought that I discussed with some businesses over the summer, is that perhaps also if there was a better way to report impacts to biodiversity or even conservation successes with biodiversity by companies. For example, the current global reporting initiative that's used by a lot of companies to report their activities and their proximity to key biodiversity areas doesn't really allow you to fully disclose all of the different potential or current biodiversity impacts that you're having, good or bad, right? So, I feel like a lot of companies do produce these sustainability reports that are very long, and often they're not communicated well to the public. And so I think by maybe changing some of our reporting strategies where corporate activities and their impacts on biodiversity become more transparent, more available to the general public and other stakeholders, we might increase competitiveness between and among companies as well as a positive public image.
Thank you. That's super interesting. So I guess a question just to throw out there, I think maybe to hear from both groups, Jen and Beth and Mark and Gabby. So we've sort of had a good overview of the different ways that scientists and NGOs think about nature and biodiversity in terms of what the value is. And I'm seeing quite a few questions here from the audience about what do we mean by value. Are we talking about the intrinsic value? Are we talking about a company's public image or profit, or there's a whole gamut of those. And so I guess I want to dig in a little to this to think about what's the bubble of values that we talk about in academia, and what's the bubble that's happening in the real world of businesses, and thinking about this sort of as a Venn diagram, where do those values overlap, and where do we need to better draw connections between these different sets of values? So perhaps I'll just, this is a good segue from the last discussion, so maybe let's start with Jen, and if Beth has anything to add, and then let Mark and Gabriella chime in after that.
Sure. So yeah, and the valuation piece, and I think when people hear value of nature, and I use the term as well, or when we think about ecosystem services, people tend to go immediately to the dollar values and assume that it's about the economics, and that is a big part of it, because like Mark said, if you can get to dollar values, it makes it really easy for companies and policymakers to understand what's that common metric of how this can be valued. But it is a broader suite of values we're talking about, obviously, here. And this work in bringing nature into corporate decisions, I tend to think about it in three broad buckets. There are those values to the business. So what are the direct benefits that a company is getting from nature, whether it's that water supply, whether it's the resource that they're taking from an ecosystem, or how they're minimizing impact on an ecosystem. So there's that, what are their cost savings, are there revenues that they're able to get from nature, but there's also the second category is around the public values that ends up can indirectly impact the business. If a community is relying on the same water resource they are, their impact on that isn't just going to impact their ability to get the water, but it could also impact that town downstream. So understanding how their activities have an impact on public values is important, both positive and negative. And then there is the intrinsic value of biodiversity. Like Beth said, that's really underlying all of this, and if we're not capturing that in some form, we could end up not really sustaining the ecosystems that are providing all those benefits. So trying to bring in all those different aspects is useful. It to me, challenging if there's the initial the decision maker is looking just for the dollar value, but bringing more of those types of values in, as much as can be brought into dollar values as possible, can be helpful, but also capturing the other values so that they can be considered in the decisions, I think, is important.
Great. Anything to add to that, Beth, or should we hear from Mark and Gab?
I can just real quickly add that I think, at this stage, again, because it's very difficult to put a number on a species, how much is it worth? I mean, how far do you go in terms of its ability to contribute to habitat and ecosystem function and ecosystem services? Where do you stop? Local, regional, global scale. I think a lot of what we've been focusing on in some of the custom tools and data sets that we've been producing is on relative value. So in other words, providing scenarios that will aid in decision making so that companies can evaluate almost, if you're familiar with NEPA and the environmental impact statement process, so coming up with a series of alternatives to action, and you can evaluate the species, ecosystem services, and costs associated with each of those actions proposed, and then use that information to make the best decisions that provide maybe not the highest returns, but good returns with low impacts to biodiversity. Coming up with alternatives so that you can improve decision making at the corporate scale.
Excellent.
So if we're talking about improving decision making at the corporate scale, I'd like for us to be more creative about the use of scenarios and valuing scenarios, perhaps probabilities and Monte Carlo analyses. So for example, if you tell me that there's a 10% chance that $1 billion event is going to occur that's going to impact my company, I'm certainly going to spend $100,000 to mitigate that, to reduce that risk from 10% to 1%. So let's start talking in those terms about biodiversity and ecosystem services loss and help business decision makers in that way. Sometimes we can't exactly quantify something, and I want us to be more accurate and more precise wherever we can, but where we can't, let's look at distributions, let's look at probabilities, and we can incorporate those kinds of things into our decision-making processes. Gabriella?
I agree, and talking about agriculture, for instance, there has been done some projects and studies like the economic of ecosystems and biodiversity that has been helping. It's a good start, but if we think about how forestry has been doing in the last 5-7 years related to carbon and the value and how this sector can better align and integrate, they are doing quite a great job in relation to the value for them and how they support this process. And this is something that agriculture is a little bit behind. Forest, long way to go. It's crucial if we want to feed the world and make sure we have the correct ecosystem service and biodiversity issue out there for the next generation. Then I agree. I totally agree with all your comments. Scenarios and more integration are crucial.
Fascinating. And in a sense, what this makes me think about is, in the broader realm of sustainability writ large, biodiversity is one piece of that puzzle. So scenarios and looking at this in a more integrated fashion will allow us to explore these trade-offs with other important attributes of sustainability. So we only have, it looks like, about 12 or 13 minutes left. I do want to take some time to get to these questions from the audience, which are really, really interesting. One that pops out at me that's a great segue from the current discussion is as follows. This is from Jessica Reamer. And the question is as follows. This is for Mark and Gabriella. When businesses are putting together analyses to determine the feasibility of a project and how nature is able to play a role, are they willing to, I lost my, just flashed, okay, sorry, where did that question go? Jessica, oh, here we go, okay. Are they willing to fund the curation of values that may be missing in terms of ecosystem service value, or is this something where businesses are relying on current information? So in other words, we have identified that we're lacking information, and it seems that in the absence of information, the status quo is that we don't include it. Are corporations willing or interested in supporting the curation of that information?
So I think the answer is both and. So in many cases, we're going to rely on existing information and other people to fund the development of more information. On the other hand, where a business case can be made, we're going to want to fund the development of further information. Again, it's like the scenario analyses that we've talked about. And we stepped up and invested $10 million over 6 years in a collaboration with the Nature Conservancy to figure out how to value ecosystem services. We feel like we've derived a lot of value from that investment. I think we're going to see further investments as the business case is made for developing more information that will lead to better decisions for not only businesses but also for society in general.
Yes, I totally agree. This for us is crucial. In fact, we need science-based information, and this is something that can help us to have a better dialogue with the society. Then we also have been investing not only in the partnership with Conservation International in the same, in a value very similar to what Dow is doing, but also we are starting another kind of collaboration with USDA here in the United States related to also how can you measure carbon and the relation with agriculture. Then yes, the quick answer is yes. For companies, this is crucial. We need more information, and it's a good opportunity for both to have a science-based approach and an understanding of what has been happening, in fact.
Thank you both. Okay, so I did want to turn to, I have a couple questions here that I want to make sure we address. Let's see. Okay, so since we have Gabriela, there are a few specific questions about Monsanto, and specifically I'm going to ask this. How does Monsanto weigh and consider externalities, for example, with insect populations like bees and mosquitoes, in the preservation and conservation efforts that you undertake? What are some examples of how Monsanto manages these unanticipated consequences? This is a question from Bridget Realmoto.
Okay, this is a very good question, important. We have doing the regulatory process evaluation in all countries where we go before we launch a product. This is required, and more than that, this is something that is necessary in order to launch a product. Then there is tons of studies and universities engaged in this process. This is something that I would be very happy to share, and we can even have a specific call if you want and others want. I can share my email, or Leah can share my email, and we can organize a call specific about that. I would be happy to share.
Thank you. Oh, there was a question asking if the slides will be available. Yes, they will be available in the archives on the Security and Sustainability Forum.org website. Okay, so I'm just trying to pick a good one. Let me ask Beth a question here. This is a devil's advocate question from Norman Kedar. He is asking, what if biodiversity loss continues? What are the possible impacts? We've already lost, 60 to 70%. What are the consequences for, life on Earth in the future of our planet? Why really do we care?
Okay, thank you. So I think, we don't really know what the tipping point is in terms of species loss. We do know that some species obviously can provide similar function within the ecosystem, and so there is some sense of redundancy. For example, 2 bee species might pollinate the same plant. And so if we lose one bee species, we have the other bee that will still take care of pollination. But what happens when that redundancy is lost is that we completely lose that ecosystem function and service. In fact, pollination is an ecosystem service that's rapidly declining in areas with certain types of pesticide use. So, you know, I think we don't really know what the tipping point is. But we do know that when that occurs, that ecosystem function and service will be gone.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Wonderful. Okay. So I'm mindful of the time. I'm going to squeeze in as many questions as as many as we can tackle. I think that Ed can correct me if I'm wrong, but there are several questions that I think we can follow up on. Is that right, Ed? We'll be able to share replies to these questions. For example, the methodology that that Dow is using for the net future value. If we collate that information from Mark, can we make this available somehow?
Absolutely. We'll do that and get an email out about tools like that.
Okay, fantastic. So I did want to direct a question towards Jen. This is an interesting one from Zain Al-Hori, and the question is climate change one of the factors that we should highlight? Is science and research when we talk about the value of biodiversity? How do we, you know, the challenges that we're talking about already are immense. How do we tweak our thinking to then incorporate concerns about climate?
Absolutely. I think climate is highly linked in a lot of these cases, and as a conservancy is thinking about not only our own conservation work, but what we're doing with companies, we think about it both from the perspective of how do we mitigate climate change, how do we reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and we've actually recently done some analysis to show at a global scale that natural ecosystems can actually play a significant role in that. So looking at how can we really scale up our conservation work, both directly through our projects, but also with partners in the private and public sectors to help mitigate climate change and look for new ways to do that. But also, climate change is already happening. So how do we actually think about adaptation of ecosystems, how they're going to change, and what that means for how we benefit from nature, and both building in adaptation strategies like the examples I showed in the slides where we're actually thinking about the role of ecosystems in human adaptation, but also that requires understanding how climate change is going to impact those ecosystems. So I think it's highly integrated in all of this, and it definitely complicates getting to data that are simple and easy to use by companies, but I think those are it's part of the complication of this, but it's critical to really understand not only the values, but how decisions need to be made.
Thank you, Jen. All right, so in our last few minutes, I'd like to give each of our panelists a minute for a final statement, and then we will turn it over to Ed for closing. In your closing statement, I'd like to hear specifically about your view on what is needed and most immediately to transition to a multi-sector approach to sustaining life on Earth and protecting biodiversity in a comprehensive way of considering biodiversity in corporate operations. So let's go in order, starting with Beth, and then following the order of the session today.
Okay. Well, I guess, you know, what I think is most important is actually, this might be a bit of a cop-out, doing exactly what we're doing, having these multi-stakeholder discussions, in-depth discussions amongst academia, NGOs, government, and corporations in order to better understand the vocabulary, the needs, the risks that each sector is bringing to the table so that we can solve these problems collaboratively.
And this is Jen. I'll build on that because I was thinking along the same lines, and I think the multi-sector collaboration really needs to focus on both creating, you know, once we're able to have that shared understanding of the different vocabularies, different risks, different drivers, what are the data and the tools that are needed to make better decisions, and how do we tap into the strengths of the different sectors. But I also really like Mark's pointing to creativity and the opportunity for really thinking in innovative ways. We need to get to scales that we haven't thought about before, so how do we really come together and have a space for that creativity to develop new solutions that can really get to the scale of the challenge we're facing?
Thank you.
so humans tend to make short-term decisions and convenient decisions. And I think our task as people who are thinking deeply about these issues is to help individuals, to help groups, to help nations, to help societies turn the short-term decision-making that they make into long-term decision-making, certainly. But while we're still in that process, help their short-term and convenient decisions to be more aligned with preserving biodiversity, preserving ecosystems' health, and preserving the ecosystem services that they need to continue to live their lives. Gabriella.
This week it was with Davos, a lot of discussion related to risks, key risks. And biodiversity was there, and the climate was there as top risk. Those two together can really disrupt the way we feed the population on the planet. And this is something that someone from the audience asked about the tipping point. We are very close to the tipping point. If you think the way we need to make sure we'll be feeding everyone and ensuring the next generation, then it's time now, I agree with all, it's time now for more of this kind of dialogue, more concrete actions and initiatives that can look in this both ways, the economic growth for the society and the environmental conservation that is absolutely necessary for the next step. And thank you for the opportunity. This kind of dialogue is really part of the process.
Wonderful. Thank you all. And I'm so inspired and encouraged by this discussion. And I really do sincerely feel like, wow, we're smart people. We should be able to figure it out. And I feel like you've said, through these types of dialogues, we really do have our work cut out for us, and we don't really have time to spare. So I'm looking forward to continuing this engagement, and I very much appreciate the thoughtful comments and questions provided by the audience. And thank you, Ed, for the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Jen. Thank you, Jen, Mark, Beth, and Gabrielle, and especially to Leah for organizing the session and moderating it. I think you all did an amazing job. And I just commend all of you and your organizations for the collaborations that you've explained in this webinar. I think it's pretty extraordinary that research organizations, NGOs focusing on capacity building, and then implementers, industry itself, really have come together. It's really very encouraging, even though we're facing some tremendous problems. The collaborations that you're talking about here really give me a lot of encouragement. So thank you for the presentations and for the work that you're doing. I hope you get a lot of funding to continue it, because it's really crucial work that you're doing. I also thank the audience that stuck with us right to the end. I want to remind you to take the survey that will pop up when you click off and sign off. The slides can be downloaded in the window under handouts. And I especially thank Arizona State University School of Sustainability for hosting this with us. They support a lot of our webinars. And the School of Sustainability was the very first school of its kind, still the leader in this educational field. And if you have kids that are in high school or junior high thinking about sustainability as a profession in any of the aspects, whether it's the biological, physical sciences, policy and programs, Arizona State University School of Sustainability is just the best place to be for multidisciplinary approaches to resilience and sustainable practices. It combines research with practical solutions. So I've been on campus many times. I work with a lot of the faculty there, and it's just the best place to be. I want to call your attention to our next webinar, Restoring the Carbon Balance, Session 2, which is on the technologies. If you're interested in the carbon balance and the issue we're having with meeting a 2 degrees centigrade rise in ambient temperatures from pre-industrial levels, this is a session that you really want to come to. We have some of the best experts in the world in this 3-part series. If you missed the first one, go to lightspeedsolutions.org and you can watch the first session. You can register there for the second session, and the third one on policy is going to be an amazing session as well. So again, I thank the panelists for just doing an amazing job here, and I thank the audience that have stuck with us right to the end, and I hope to see you in subsequent webinars.
Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.